Well, I want to welcome you to today's discussion. I am very excited. I'm thrilled to be able to have a very special guest on today. But I first just want to say thank you so much for liking, sharing, and subscribing. The channel is continuing to grow. I will be at 2,000 subscribers probably within a couple of weeks. And I just want to thank so many of you for sharing and actually just encouraging me. I can't tell you how much encouragement I've gotten from so many of you via email and via social media, or whatever it is. It's just been something that's really kind of kept me going more than you know. I want to introduce our speaker today. Before I do that, I want to give you a little bit of an understanding of what we're going to cover. We're going to be covering this idea of Christianity and mental health interfacing in our churches. And that's a process, not an event. And there's a lot of complicated factors as we as churches are starting to incorporate mental health more so. But there's some things that I think we need to talk about from people that I think are qualified to help us work through that. And so I've got my former professor, Dr. Christopher Habben. He is a former president of the American Association of Marriage and Family Therapists. He currently serves as professor and site director of the Marriage and Family Therapy program in Lenexa, Kansas. He has received 2 degrees from Fuller Theological Seminary, and his doctoral research studied differentiation as a predictor of extramarital activity. Dr. Habben, welcome to the channel.
Thank you. Good to be here, Kyle.
Absolutely. Well, I'm going to just jump right into it. Why don't you tell us a little bit about your journey to Christ and why you then decided to go and become a therapist and professor?
Okay. Well, mine probably won't be a super dramatic experience filled with a lot of excitement. I was born and raised in a mainline Protestant denomination, so my family was a family that for many generations the Christian faith had been very important to them. So I was very active in our church. Attended church on Sundays. We went to Sunday school and youth group and those kinds of events. In my particular denomination, people are generally baptized as infants, and then at some point in the journey, you make your own kind of profession of your faith, which for me, something I did around 16 years old. So it was sort of, I think, me acknowledging what my parents had set out for me. I went off to a small private college that I loved very much in Holland, Michigan, called Hope College, with aspirations that I would become a doctor. And this church, or this college, was associated with our church denomination, very high academic standard as well. And ran into organic chemistry, and things kind of went in a different direction that I thought maybe that they should. And I had always thought that if a world in medicine didn't work, then the ministry would be something that I might be very interested in. I had finished those 4 years of undergraduate training, and thought, gosh, before I just didn't. I financially and for some other reasons, I thought maybe I need to work for a while before I go to a seminary route. And so I worked for our college for 5 years as a college recruiter and enjoyed that very much. During that time, I met my wife, and it was shortly after that I went off to Fuller Seminary to get a degree in marriage and family therapy. And if I'm honest with you, Kyle, I thought that I would probably go out and get some training and then maybe look to be a part of a church ministry somewhere where the focus was on congregational care, so less on the preaching up front and more so on the how do we help people in the trenches of what they're doing. And wound up with a degree in marriage and family therapy, as well as theology while I was there. And so it really introduced me to the field of marriage and family therapy, which is a separate and distinct mental health profession from others, but overlapping with psychology and professional counseling and social work. And said to my wife, gosh, I feel like if I don't go try to get a PhD, I'll regret that. And to my surprise, she said, well, then we should do that. And went to Virginia Tech University and had a great experience there. And that's, completed my research or my dissertation in 2000, and Then I worked for a hospital for a year, working on an addiction and a mental health unit in sort of the thumb area of Michigan, before landing a position here at Friends University that I've been at now for 20 years. And I love being a professor. It's a really, truly is a privilege and an honor. We work very hard, as you do in the therapy room, to help people have a transformational experience. We'd like to tell people, if you're the same person when you leave as when you started, either we failed you or you've not engaged, our program very well. And it's just a remarkable kind of experience, I think, to be doing that. And I find being a professor really helps me. Each year that I'm teaching something, I learn the material just a little bit deeper than the year before. It's kind of interesting that you never get to a place, at least I haven't, maybe because I'm not the sharpest tool in the drawer, but I don't ever feel like I get saturated on the material. It seems like each time you learn it in a new and deeper kind of way. And I think that really also helps advance my work as a clinician. And I work primarily with couples and families, but do a lot of different things and have supervised a lot of different people along the way. And so all of those things together create an experience for me where every day is different, but it's always involved in a process of helping people help themselves or helping people help others help themselves along the way. And it's just been, for me, a really rewarding kind of journey. So that's probably a longer answer than what you might have hoped for, but that's my best shot at that.
Beautiful, beautiful. No, I appreciate that. And that backstory is important because you're a human being,
Yeah.
not just this professor who's just in there. So mental health is starting for sure to be more accepted in our faith communities. The question is, to some extent, is why do you believe that this shift is kind of really happening at an accelerated rate now?
When I was at Fuller Seminary, I remember picking up a book because I was really intrigued by the intersection of psychology and Christianity. And as you probably know, Kyle, there are journals dedicated to that intersection. Was at a university or a seminary where there were faculty that were really devoted to that integrative effort. And there were other folks who really took a strong position that psychology and Christianity they're actually antagonistic with each other. And I don't know if it is a notion. I don't know, to be honest with you, what some of the fear is for that kind of position. I think maybe there's an assumption that psychology at its root goes back to people who but developed the field, who might have more of an atheistic kind of approach to life, and somehow that thinking would transition down to the work that we're doing day to day. And I just couldn't really disagree with that more. But I think your question is, why is it accelerating? And there's so much going on in our culture, from COVID and just the events that have been going on in the social realm. I think that is creating an increasing amount of anxiety. And I'm showing my age of 55, where I start to think that, to some degree, tools like this are really helpful and meaningful. And I think they really are dangerous too. So,
Wow.
Things like, I'm watching kids, feel like at the core, I think we need two things, Kyle. We need to know that we're safe, and we need to know that we matter. And I think those are, in my work, when we peel back the onion, so to speak, I really feel like those are two things that we really get to at the core of things. And social media can be really helpful, but inherent in that do I matter piece is the importance of inclusion. And boy, it's a simple thing where I call a friend and no, I can't meet tonight. And then I go to Facebook and I see a picture of you with other people. And things like that create a very powerful message, or messages of, I have to look a certain way, I have to act a certain way, I have to achieve a certain thing. Because even though people know I'm picking one of 1,000 pictures to post up here, we sort of just get sucked into this notion of, look how things look in Kyle's world, or look how things look in Chris's world, not knowing kind of what might be going in the background. So I get concerned about what a really good tool, just like anything, they are very helpful to us, and there's danger to that as well. But without a doubt, there is a rising experience, and I think isolation, and people really. And isn't it interesting that we're theoretically more connected than ever with tools like this and other things, and yet we are never more alone.
Thank you for saying that.
I got on an airplane just last week coming back from an event, and sitting next to me was a person who, honestly, if I'm really honest, I'm not sure what he or she looked like. They had a mask on for their COVID thing, and they had a hoodie on that was pulled down and really was covered up. And I was just captured by, should I try to reach towards this person and acknowledge that I see them and that I'm interested in them and that they're important to me sitting next to me on the flight back? Or do I respect the pretty clear meta message of leave me alone? And I think there is with COVID and so many other things, there's just a level of fear that's going on. And so the first place, the two places that people often go to before they go to a therapist or a counselor or so on is their doctor and their pastor. And I just think it's the first place that people come in and say, that was a lovely sermon, but here's what's going on in my life, and how do I square that?
Absolutely.
And so I mean, I don't, in our particular program, we have a lot of students that do their clinical training in churches, and I think it's a wonderful thing because it is a place where, what a colleague of mine used to say, it's a chance to put tennis shoes to our faith, that it's something that's not just ethereal kind of comments in place, but is a place for us to actually let's put these things that we're talking about, both in the clinical room, both in the classroom, and in the congregation and in our churches. Let's put those to practice. And don't get me started, probably, but I just think there's a large overlap between my particular profession and what a lot of the essential components of a Judeo-Christian theology have to say. Primarily that they center on the notion of relationship. And again, it's interesting where our relationships tend to go right now. So COVID, some anxieties, understandable anxieties, as we're learning to have conversations around things that have been underground before. And I think that's a good thing, but they're anxiety provoking for folks. I want to be careful how I say this, but I think sort of the introduction of postmodern philosophy into our world and culture is an intriguing thing. I think to some degree, many churches and leaders might have a skeptical approach to postmodernity, which in some ways, perhaps I'm exaggerating, but all truth is rather relative. And I do think there are some problems with postmodern theory in the sense that it's kind of like, every person is left to be an island. You are free to have your own kind of world, your own worldview, but at the same, and nobody's really sort of going to challenge that, which is nice and freeing, but it also is kind of isolating because you do you, Kyle, and I'll do me. But we don't really have conversation about how those intersect. Now, I think postmodernity has done a lot of great things about introducing us to the challenges of people who have been marginalized and why, and some of the institutional kinds of things that we do to the language that we use, the actions that we take, the labels that we put on people. I think those are all really fair things, but I think there are some down things to sort of the influence of postmodernity on our culture as well.
Well, you've answered.
Random.
No, you're good. No, that's helpful. The way you've just in a little bit more of a you really kind of hit several different things. One of the things that I really appreciate you just shared is that you have a both and relationship with postmodernity, right? Postmodernism. I think that's huge because whether it be CRT, whatever critical lens we're looking through to have a meta approach, like we want a 10,000-foot view, it's going to have some inherent flaws, especially as we start to relate it to a theological understanding of the church and God. And so we can't wholesale adopt everything we see in postmodernity or in whatever biblical critical, racial critical theory there is. There's a both and that we need some maturity to be able to engage. And I really kind of like where you're coming from too with this, hey, you have your right to your philosophy, but that philosophy could leave you very lonely because in how we are created relationally. So fine, if you have that perspective, you have it, but just notice how lonely. It might be very lonely for you. And so I like how you've kind of situated things, and you've answered several questions actually there. I don't know if you had something else you wanted to share.
No, it's interesting, Kyle, there are, after 20 years in this field, there are places where I find myself boiling down concepts to a couple of things, and you put your finger right on something that to me, there is a radical difference between what part of it is a maturity thing. Part of it is just a way of looking at things, but there's a radical difference between looking at the world in either or terms. You're either for me or against me. You're either right or you're wrong. You're either, it's just that black and white thinking, I don't think gets us very far as much as both and. And I don't mean that I think both and is a harder way to go.
Absolutely.
So it means, and again, because we're created to be relational beings, which to me comes as a central message right out of the Genesis narrative. Now what we have to do is always balance individuality and togetherness. That is a real, as Murray Bowen had introduced us to do. And I think as simple as that concept is, that is really difficult, and we can go too far in one of the directions or the other. So how do I take a position where, I like to be in a place, I love being around folks who have different ideas than me. My favorite course in my undergraduate program was a course entitled Christianity Encounters Other Faiths, because I think when we can have the faith to doubt our own thinking, the faith to doubt our own faiths so much, then I can explore other things. Say, just because a person has a different faith than me doesn't mean that that we should just exclude them. I think our call is to be in relationship with people, and to be, whether it's with a partner or a friend or a colleague, how do I take a position of, I really want to hear you. I really want to understand you. The more I understand you, frankly, the more I understand myself.
Right.
When a fish jumps out of water, it's not necessarily air that it discovers, it's water, because it recognize, I'm in not water. I learn about my Christianity by encountering other people with other points of view genuinely, and not as a place to say, well, as a starting position, you can't be anywhere near the ballpark, but to say, I could be wrong, I suppose. And so let's start there and teach me about you. And that's how I learn about, and I think a lot of times we can be a little bit fearful of that, and we get into positions of defending our position, or taking almost an antagonistic position of, what you have to offer is, it's not going to be of interest to me because I've already got my own position. John Gottman, as probably one of the premier couples therapists in the country, has taught us that good marriages involve, I love the juxtaposition of these words, that people who accept influence from their partner. And I love those two words together, because if I'm accepting influence from you, Kyle, I'm not trying to figure out who you want me to be and then be that. That's appeasing you. I'm not trying to dominate you to my position. If I'm accepting influence, I might say, I tend to have this political view. You might have that political view. But rather than let me try to debate you, as we have on all of our television programs, let me understand your point of view. And I might come to a place to say, I can see why you have that political position. And I actually respect that. You wouldn't be happy in my political position. It's changed the way I think about my own political position. is changed by this conversation. That to me is accepting influence. And that's, I think, oftentimes a harder way to go. We have lost our capacity, I think, in many ways, or our skill set in truly dialoguing with people. We will often say it's important for us to have a conversation, but that conversation, our training on TV is to, our training on TV is to have kind of like what our screens look like right now, two talking heads, and we have two positions, and the more conflictual we'll be about it, the more people want to watch it.
Oh, how horrible that is. Wow. You just named something.
Instead of, where are you coming from? Teach me. I mean, not teach me, but help me. I really want to know you.
I like that. I really want to know you. There's a lot of the things that you've just shared. I want to, right. For a lot of people, their theology is in threat. Okay. They have a theology that maybe has needed some therapy. And as people become a little bit more, what trauma does, and when you look at where people, when they're living in threat, it shuts down their theological imagination. And so what you're saying is not just philosophically, but theologically, someone who, like when you look at Jesus would go and have these exchanges with the Pharisees and the scribes and so forth. His theological imagination allowed him to go and have these conversations rather than run from them. But when he had them, he would ask questions, and I love everything you're saying. I think the point is that we have to make sure that we're not living in survival, because I find that the more threatened people feel, the more either or they become.
Absolutely.
So then we've got to kind of power down that threat. One of the threats that I want to just name as we move this forward is separating the good from the bad as we merge the two. You keep talking about the both and that's so helpful. I think for a lot of Christian communities, they feel like they've taken a lot of hits, not just because of the pandemic, but because they feel like the moral slidings are so steep. And they feel like, wait a minute, the environment that I knew to be a little bit more Christian is becoming so much less Christian by the day. And I feel like I need to protect my kids. And now we can't even on the pulpit preach about this or that. And so people just are sort of becoming even more galvanized at times in their position. There is some unhealthy humanism out there, right? So how can we, because I don't want people to kick out mental health just because they're afraid of humanism. What are some ways to help faith communities separate the good from the bad?
Well, I think one of the things, if I'm really honest, which is always an interesting thing to say, isn't it? If I'm really honest, as opposed to the editing that I must be doing 24/7 otherwise. I think there's a lot of damage, frankly, that's been done by the church to Christianity. I had a title of an article that I once wanted to write, and maybe I will, and it sounds kind of offensive, but I had the notion of wanting to resurrect Christianity from the Christians. I think it was Gandhi who said, I would be a follower. It's Christ I don't have a problem with. It's all of his people. And I think there's where I'm going with that is I think it's really valuable for us. I mean, we talk about in our faith the importance of having a personal relationship with Jesus. And yet oftentimes we get pretty quick in telling people how that personal relationship should look like. And I think there is a give and a take to be able to say, as I read what I consider to be scripture, as I walk with other people, as I focus on what is it that is that God is trying to tell me in this particular world, I form my own kind of opinions of that. Now, if somebody has a different position about something, I go back to what we were talking about earlier to say, you can have that position, or you can make that particular claim if it's what you were saying in the pulpit, to which I might say, I'm taking that and I'm going to ask myself, so where does this stretch me, and what would this mean? And as I personally have conversations with people on different topics. And there are people very close to me who have very different feelings and very different assumptions about what might be sort of God's will in our life. To me, it's in those conversations, instead of saying this is, I personally should own that I get reactive when people tell me, this is what God is telling you, or I've decided that I'm sort of the decider of your eternal salvation, as opposed to, what are you taking away from what you're hearing? What are you learning about yourself? And as we have conversation about that and are willing to ask questions that sort of own our own particular position, as well as to ask questions that might be, I'm not sure I'm landing in the same place. How are you getting there? To me, it's in that dialogue of things that become really, really important. I don't know if I'm really, you've asked, how do you separate the good stuff from the bad stuff? And again, I think I wrestle with that a bit, because what's good and what's bad is very subjective, and is maybe, instead of subjective, I should say very contextual. And I really am a person that believes, when it comes to the kind of work that I do, that all behavior makes sense in some kind of context. That doesn't mean I agree with all behavior. That doesn't mean I condone all behavior. That doesn't mean I accept all behavior, but all behavior makes sense to me in context. And so, to what degree am I seeking the context of that particular action? You know, back to my statement about the article that I was sort of wanting to write, you know, many times, if what you're talking about is something from the pulpit that says, this is how you are to act or be, or this is who you're to be with, I can appreciate wanting to make sure that you are engaging people who will allow you to flourish your faith. But at the same time, when I think about who Jesus hung out with, it was, if he came back right now, I don't think he'd be in the churches. I just, you know?
Oh, man. Oh, he'd have something to say, but yeah.
Yeah, well, that doesn't mean that I just think I'm not sure that's where he'd be spending his time.
Well,
and I think it's going to be in places where we, often, sometimes, I mean, the people that he hung out with were often almost, no, I shouldn't say hung out with, the people that he engaged, when I think of it again, were the marginalized peoples.
absolutely.
On any number of issues, on gender, on the way they were living their life, on diseases that they had, and so on. And again, that to me just goes back to what degree, maybe I'm sort of wandering around a bit and responding to your question, landing on a place of answering for myself, of to what degree does what we're doing in church, to what degree does that create inclusion? I mean, genuine inclusion. And it's not my job, in my opinion, to really decide what, I mean, your relationship with God is between you and God. I have a relationship with you that's between you and I, and I'm going to work on that piece. And that means I can authentically share who I am, be who I am, but also be really curious about another person and really engage in this dialogic position. I'm just not sure that happens a lot anymore. The more even the question really has a notion of there is good stuff, and it's
The reason,
it's kind of bifurcated. I'm like, I just think in these spectral kind of terms, and it's hard for me to answer, good and bad, because I just think that's so contextualized.
yeah, what you're saying totally makes sense. Let me give you a little bit of a background for why I asked that question. First of all, two things. When I went through the program, this was an awesome moment. I had a professor who just had made mention that, hey, there is a lot of harmful stuff out there as it relates to, as we merge Christianity and we merge trauma, mental health, religion, those two together, there is a way to do that. Because the reality is that the scripture has, like, we have to be careful how we try to get the text to perform. Like, I think sometimes we try to get the Bible to answer questions it's not trying to answer. I think we have to be careful not to try to get psychology to answer questions that it's maybe not designed to answer. But when you put the two together, I think that's where you find, again, being image bearers and being human. As a human being, we have these different parts of us. And the way I think of it is this, Dr. Habben. Some people kind of look at things that there's a difference between a stubborn heart and a stubborn wound. So there's this idea that if you have a stubborn heart, which we all have component of, that, hey, repentance is a thing. And this is for a lot of churches, man. They're struggling with grace and truth, right? There is a component where our heart needs to be changed. Discipleship is impossible unless we let God change the desires of our heart. Okay, that's when we swear allegiance to Christ, we become his person. We say, hey, look, I'm going to repent of my stubborn heart. That also on the other side, this component of us that we have stubborn wounds. And when you see Jesus engage, to your point, people, the paralytic, folks that were lowing through the roofs, people caught in adultery, tax collectors, people who are rejected, the dejected in society. He looks at folks who say, hey, I've got a wound. It's not just the sin, but there's a wound. And I think there's a both and our society seems to polarize into one or the other. That it's only that you have a stubborn wound or you only have a stubborn heart, when the reality is that I think Jesus's understanding, his definition of tolerance probably would offend liberals and conservatives. And so that's what I'm talking about, is that grace and truth piece.
Right. Absolutely. And I really love how you say that. And I think maybe as I was wandering around in your question, I'm trying to say, I'm interested in that wounded part. I am. On the grace and truth side, whatever. I mean, again, I'm like, you can have, and we're going to vary a lot on what we identify as truth. And I love that you just articulated that incredibly well, Kyle, as you always do. I'm just more interested in the wounded part than the stubborn heart. Now, if you're hearing that as I don't care about the person with a stubborn heart, I'm like, to me, the stubborn heart usually comes out of a wound.
Yeah.
Right?
Yep.
So that's why I say all behavior makes sense in context. People do all kinds of things, including me, that are often unattractive or things that wouldn't necessarily be like, boy, I think that would be God's proudest moment of me.
Yeah.
But it doesn't justify why I did that. It doesn't mean that I ought not to make repair about that, but at least I can understand how I got to the place where I made the decision to say or do or not do what just happened. And I find when you can, at least in my opinion, I love what you're saying, because the wound, when you really tend to a person's wound, Henry Nouwen says we should bind up our own wounds so that we can be hospitable hosts to people that come into our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And when you really when you welcome them in, whoever they are, and whatever position they have, and whatever place of difference that you have with them, that you welcome them in with with genuine interest in their lives, and be willing to have conversation, which doesn't mean I have to abdicate what my own kind of positions are on things, right, and I can be with you. My favorite theologian is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and a lot of his life was recorded and reflected on by one of his students, Eberhard Bethge. And somewhere he tells the story of how, Bonhoeffer was able, because of his social class, to not really he could avoid getting drafted into the German army, but his friend Bethge knew what a pacifist Bonhoeffer was, and how against where the German government was going he was. And so he was quite anxious to have a meeting with Bonhoeffer when he had his uniform on. And Bonhoeffer exhibited all this kinds of, if you will, this word grace to him, knowing that they might have had different positions, knowing that there were lots of different contextual variables about how they both were where they were. And whatever the symbol of the uniform meant, whatever about what it was representing, Bonhoeffer was incredibly engaging with his friend, and he left, not his words, but my words, his friend left with a sense of inclusion and acceptance from his friend. Now, again, I don't know that Bonhoeffer would have necessarily changed his opinion about a variety of things, but he made he created that hospitable space of welcomeness for his friend. And I just think that's what I'm hoping that we do in our churches. And I think sometimes when we get the churches themselves can feel really wounded or defensive and can take a hard position. And I understand that. I'm not trying to be critical of that, but you know as well as I do, in relationships, the more hurt we are, oftentimes the more rigid we can become.
Absolutely.
And rigidity doesn't get us anywhere. Flexibility does. A willingness. This is why I go back to, I love Gottman's term so much. The juxtaposition of accepting influence doesn't mean that I'm radically changing at the core that I am, but I'm willing to I'm coming to a conversation open that I might be different than when I leave. It's why I liked when I said my favorite course in my own undergraduate training was I wanted to be open to what other religions were saying so that I could learn about my own, as well as generally say there was a risk that I might pursue another faith and go, wow, this makes a lot more sense to me. What was I thinking with a Christian point of view? And I was like willing to risk that and to be able to say, okay, well, this now for me, I land on Christianity, not because mom and dad brought me up in the church, which they did, not because I'm a womb to tumor, but because I am claiming this independently for myself.
Right. So there's what you're talking about is kind of the wrestle. I think of Marty Solomon, and he's got kind of a couple concepts, but the last concept he talks about is the wrestle. Nice. And I think that when you look at what we've probably tried to bottle up and package and sell to people is certainty.
Right.
And when you do that, certainty is like a drug. It's a controlled substance. It creates dependence, and when you take it away, you see withdrawals. Yes. And that the people want security in changing times. I think right now, when I look at a lot of folks in churches, like I just did for our church, I just did a trauma presentation on Saturday, and I talked about the stubborn wound and the stubborn heart. And I got people who want to meet with me and kind of talk through, how do you help people with this grace and truth piece? Because I think just where a lot of people feel threatened is they just feel like we're losing truth. We're losing obedience to Christ. And they feel like mental health comes in with its extra grace and extra focus on grace in the wound, and it just lowers the standard. And I'm just going to be completely honest with you. I think there's a lot of churches that are worried about, okay, well, now you're sleeping with your girlfriend, and now you're smoking this and that, and how's it going to affect my kids? And they just feel threatened. Mm-hmm. I do believe to some degree that our wounds make us selfish, but I absolutely believe that the wounded parts of us that are most addicted most times, that the wounded parts of us are the thing that God wants to give the most grace towards, because that's what makes us human. And I think that I have to kind of stand a little bit more in the gap of the threat posture that a lot of churches are in, because they want to make sure, for me, I'm in mental health. They want to make sure that I'm going to really talk about that grace piece. And I always do, because Jesus always did. At the end of the day, Jesus always talked truth. He offended people. Yeah. He didn't get crucified if he didn't offend anyone. And on the other side of that, why he offended people whose hearts were hard. He offended people who gave into their rigidity, to your point.
Right. Yes. Yes. Well, okay. So part of the challenge here is, again, so to take this conversation from a macro level down to a very local level for me, I am a marriage and family therapist. I believe I'm very similar to a lot of other mental health practitioners, and I'm different, and I am a part of a church congregation that I've been a part of for 20 years. It is very similar to lots of other churches and congregations around the world, and in other ways, very different. My personal experience, I might have even shared this with you before. It's amazing to me how many times on Sunday when I'm listening to a message, I will say to my wife after, what they were talking about, we talked about that last night in class. Now, we may not have used exactly the same words. Mm-hmm. Concepts, the key notions feel really similar. Why I believe my particular mental health perspective of marriage and family therapy begins with an assumption it's systemically minded, and so it's built to me around the idea of relationship. From the get-go, Christianity to me is fundamentally about relationship.
Mm-hmm.
The I and thou between people, and the I and thou between myself and God, and that vertical as well as that horizontal thing. And all of Scripture to me is about how we are, how we have ebbed and flowed in our relationship
Absolutely.
with God, and so the redemption piece. And all of that, but the Old Testament is a fascinating kind of place. And to your notion of wrestling, by the way, absolutely. I mean, I think it's interesting to me where transformation happens for people is in the wilderness stories.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's Israel walking around in the wilderness for 40 years or Christ in the wilderness, there's always a wilderness kind of place before a person almost comes out of that wilderness time differently. So I'm trying to perhaps, maybe what I'm saying is I'm trying to sort of say, what is the meta message that I'm hearing in the clinical room? What is the meta message that I'm hearing on Sunday? And where do those meta messages intersect? So there might be preaching on this on a particular story, but what is the meta message about relationship with God and relationship to our fellow person? I mean, maybe I'm oversimplifying things, but that's why I think, when asked, Jesus said the first two, I mean, what are the greatest commandments? And it's to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, and mind. And the other one is to love your neighbor as yourself. That's pretty rich, because to love my neighbor as myself, I mean, I better be doing a good job of loving me and taking care of me, which a lot of people have some difficulty with. I need to do an effective job of taking care of my neighbor. And that, I mean, to me, that's almost the intersection of these two fields. Like, so how do I make sure I'm in the best place with my relationship with God? And again, I'm not very evangelical in my clinical work. I don't really find my particular work is not one where I see myself, by the way, as a therapist who is a Christian. I don't see myself doing Christian therapy. One is a adverb and one is a noun. And I'm not trying in any way to be disparaging of Christian therapy or Christian counseling, but I think by language, they're different.
I appreciate you sharing that, because that's something why I brought you on. We need some clarity on. I need someone who, that's, so you have, like, on the extreme, just for our audience, I know this is a pretty broad conversation, right, folks. On one side of the spectrum, you have this idea of ultra psychology, just behavioral. Like, I mean, a lot of psychology started behavioral, and then it was cognitive, and then we added the emotional and so forth, and then systemic. And way on the other side is what you would call like nouthetic counseling by Jay Adams, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. What that is basically saying is, it's taking what Paul says, that you are competent to counsel, that noutheteo, that verb there. It's basically saying if you have God's Spirit there's general revelation and there's special revelation, but basically when it comes to like medical stuff, that's all like general revelation. But he's saying that when you're helping someone, you're counseling them, that's special revelation based. In other words, you have to have God's Spirit, you have to have God's Word, and if you have those two things, you can help someone grow and heal and all of that. And all you need is the Bible. Well, the problem with that is that, again, people are realizing that the Bible is a relationship book. And it's about how to have a relationship with God. But there are aspects of trying to get the Bible to perform in ways that it's not designed, or it's not trying to answer certain questions. I don't completely agree with that perspective of the noutheteo or the nouthetic counseling. I think somewhere in the middle, we can take good and we can help people to heal and grow. Like, for example, like you were saying about taking care of yourself. You see that in Philippians 2. Do nothing out of salvation, but as consider others better than yourselves, but likewise as you see yourself. Is the Old Testament, in terms of loving your neighbor as yourself. I think to some degree, and I appreciate you kind of talking about this difference, is Christian counseling is great, but there could come a point where you've got to deal with the body. So, hey, now I'm going to give you The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk. And
Right.
Scripture has something to say about how we deal with the bodies too. The body's a temple. Don't unite it with a prostitute. Well, what do we know from what happens when you're promiscuous, what it does to you neurologically? We know it deranges your arousal template. Scripture isn't saying that specifically, but will we know that without scientific studies? No. So there's a blend that I think if we're wise, to your point, you're not so threatened that you're going to lose your faith if you start asking questions. And what I'm hearing you say to some degree is Christians kind of have, a lot of churches have had this certainty and it hasn't allowed them to mature, or this supposed certainty. There's just a lack of maturation, so to speak.
Yeah, that you really got your finger, I think, on something important, Kyle, that we live in an uncertain world.
Yeah.
And certainty, and I need to be, careful, because I'm not just careful in the sense that I don't want to impose sort of my way of thinking on other people, because I'm very interested in, to what you were saying, because we are relational beings. I know there are people all the time. There are people that we have students that I said to a student that came in the other day, you could read the phone book to me and I think I'd find it healing. She just has something about herself that I really, and I'm hardly exaggerating. It's just the way she would engage that. And because there's something incredibly relational with her, and she has that before she experiences any of our quote unquote training. And, I probably, there are people in your life, as there are certainly in mine, who they don't have formalized mental health training, but they are certainly helpful to people in crises. Now, I also think there's value in understanding what really is schizophrenia, and what is depression, and what is anxiety, and what is ADHD, and what is what are other things, and what are helpful ways that we can employ to address those. And again, whoever you have on the clinical side is going to be doing things on some ways similarly and some ways differently. I find a lot of times I might have a client who had a different therapist, and their approach to something is radically different than the way I would go about doing it. It doesn't mean it's better or worse. It just means it's different. I have this word process hanging up on my wall because I am always trying to move, to use, not to eliminate content, but to understand the content about what people are saying, to get at what is the what is the process that's going on. And when I think about the process, almost always it gets back to this question of, am I safe and do I matter? And you're exactly right about how trauma plays into that. So understanding how our brain functions, we certainly train students like that in a program like ours, but there are lots of lay people who are very familiar with understanding the amygdala and how it responds to trauma and all of that. Does that mean they can't be helpful to people? Of course not. So it's kind of like we all can. I mean, this is where I like the image of the body. We all have different places where we can intercede with people. Sometimes I find when people come in for treatment, it's like, well, a psychiatrist might be able to be helpful psychopharmacologically here with maybe depression. But it might be another person that's walking with that person weekly in a clinical setting to get at what is the hurt, pain, or frustration that might be underneath that depression. There might be a friend who's walking with them just to make sure somebody's checking in on them. All three of those levels of intersection, there's different depth to that, but all three of those are important to that person experiencing healing. And, I don't want to minimize any of that on some level. So there are people that go to counselors and therapists who have different, I mean, who might be, I would say my authority, if you will, as a counselor comes from Holy Spirit or from the Bible, and it's on that authority that I'm sharing this with you. And that's probably not an approach that I would take. That doesn't mean that those approaches aren't helpful and meaningful to people.
Right.
It's just not the way I would go about doing it for a variety of reasons. I do, for me, believe that, and this is maybe I'm getting into a circle that's, or a route that's not helpful to what you're wanting to talk about. But for me, I really believe that we bear a measure of, I just always want people to be able to be independent in terms of their own autonomy and decide, and to help them decide what. And I will say to people, I may not be your guy. You may need something a little bit, or if a person comes into an office like mine and they're asking how, if God exists, how could a God allow this to happen? Like, well, I'm not necessarily afraid to move into a conversation about that. And I might say, what does your faith teach you about that, or not teach you about that? Because I'm not trying to impose, necessarily my vantage point. I want to know where they are and how they got there, which goes back to, some things that I think that we were talking about earlier on the truth and grace kind of piece and so on. I just want to help people. I want to create an optimal level of frustration for people.
I like that.
Because and from person to person, that will vary, right? If you work with a person that's bathing in trauma versus a person who for not because of any, just they've had a different kind of experience, one's not better or worse, but our ability to tolerate frustration would vary a bit. And I really think that part of my work is to support people and where they are and to provoke them enough to change. And so sometimes, an approach might be, I just want you to make sure you leave this office, regardless of the approach, feeling held and just know that God loves you. I'm like, that's valuable. And in my office, I'm like, I want you to know that there's a kind of safety here, but if I'm doing my job, I'm also going to try to frustrate you to a level that will be helpful to you. I don't want to frustrate you that it's hurtful. I just want to ask hard questions, because that's where the wilderness is. That's where the wrestling is. All of those places of wilderness is where transformation happened. Even Jacob wrestling with the angel. It's like, if I remember my Bible right, it was shortly after that he became Israel. So wrestling is good. I want to bring people into the wrestling of things, which means I have to wrestle with things, which means I have to be comfortable wrestling with things. I need to be able to know to keep myself in a place. It doesn't mean I check myself at the door, but how do I make sure that I am truly, every person that comes into my office, there's lots of things, including me, that I think, what were you thinking doing that? If God were sitting here, do you think he would be pleased by that? No. But if I'm like, how could you be doing that? This is back to your wounded thing. I'm like, how did we get to a place where that was a strategy to move forward? I'm rambling.
Love it. No, when I came through the program, just for the audience for a moment, this is the program I went through, Fringe University back there. That's the diploma. It was one of the best decisions I have ever made to go to Fringe University. And I'm going to out myself. When I entered the program, I just graduated from college, and I had this posture. I'm not going to lie. I remember thinking, I'm a Christian. What am I really going to learn from becoming a counselor? Mm-hmm. All it took was that first intensive week for me to realize how ignorant and arrogant that was. Like, it's one thing to be ignorant. It's another thing to be, when you add arrogance, that's when it becomes a problem. And I just remember thinking after that first week, I don't know that whatever I thought about being a Christian it just changed my idea of being a Christian. Even Dr. Jen, so Dr. Jennifer Nelson, Dr. Timothy Nelson, they pushed us in our relationship, with our relationship with God and with other people in ways that I've never been pushed. And
Mhm.
so I think for some people, they just, if you're not spitting scriptures at them, they don't necessarily feel like they get really worried. I just wanted to just say I love the program. The program helped me spiritually. The program has, anyway, could you just help our listeners to know why? I'm going to give you a chance to brag. Why is Friends University? Why is marriage and family therapy at Friends University the way to go amidst the available options?
Well, that's first of all, Kyle, that's really kind of you. And doctors Tim and Jennifer Nelson aren't with us anymore here at Friends, and so but their legacy on what we do here is long and is still very present. I particularly, as I said earlier, there are lots of different mental health disciplines. What I like about family therapy, and I say this without any intent to be disparaging towards any other mental health approach, but I really wrestled when I was in seminary about the difference between being a counselor and a therapist. And it feels to me like if I go seek wise counsel from somebody, it feels a little bit more like I'm asking for their advice and their direction, um, which feels like kind of a first order. How do I make this change? Therapy to me is, when I think about a physical therapist, I'm thinking about a person who has had some kind of injury or trauma to their body, and the physical therapist is trying to push them through a measure of pain to get to a place of their highest level of functioning, whether it's back to that original state or even better, or at least as close to that as they can be. Again, that's not a fair thing to say about other disciplines per se, but the word was important to me. And that's what brought me into family therapy, which has a very systemic kind of notion. And I think more than the other disciplines is very focused on relationship. And that's to me why that is such a wonderful intersection. That's why I feel like so much of what I hear regularly in church or conversations that I'm involved with in church parallel so significantly what I find myself doing in the classroom. So the field itself is one that I personally just have a great admiration for and a fit for. And again, I just want to be clear, that's not disparaging of other disciplines. My brother is a psychologist, and we have very interesting, conversations and very, interesting, different points of view on things. As far as our program here, I just have loved my 20 years here at Friends. We want to create an environment that is really dedicated to excellence in terms of helping people really be excellent at this craft, this art, really, that I think that we're training people to do. There are some folks that can know all of the theoretical things, but as you know, Kyle, to put to practice the skill of being in a place to try to help a person find their way through that wounded spot takes a lot of practice and training. And I think we work very hard on the training aspect. The classroom piece is important, but students here have a very extensive clinical training piece that I think is what makes our program and others really good. People leave here feeling like I feel really equipped to begin to take on the challenges, or to know that I need more equipment at times.
That's good.
I need to further my equipping because
Yep.
this out of my league, as opposed to just pressing into something and getting over their head. I think, and I really love, I think that the two colleagues that I have as co-faculty and the adjunct faculty that we have here are outstanding. And I think we all believe centrally in the importance of relationship. We want to have a meaningful relationship with our students. We recognize we make mistakes. I mean, some of my best moments as a professor is when a student's sitting in my office and I'm having to make repair because of something I might have said or done myself, or the way something has gone in the program that's been hurtful, and they've cared enough about the relationship to come in and say, I'm angry with you. And rather than us saying, shut up, this is our program, get on board or get out, of saying, what do you tell me about that anger? Because I think that is where we're heading. I mean, you talked earlier about I think you were talking about the word, sort of the notion of the redemptive essence of our particular faith. And in my work, I just think so much about what we do is helping people effectively repair with other people, maybe effectively repairing with themselves, effectively repairing with other people, and if I'm honest, reflectively repairing with God. Now, we are not, Friends University was started long ago by the Quakers. We're not formally affiliated with the Quakers any longer, but there's so much of a heritage here that is very much about, that's so rich in that Quaker heritage that is really a very accepting faith tradition. And one that's really about promoting peace and harmony and standing against those places of dismissing other people. And so I just think those are some of the things that really make this valuable. And our faculty have really been involved at some pretty significant levels, I think, just in our field as a whole. And we're just really proud of what we do here. And there are lots of other programs doing lots of great things. I appreciate, Kyle, your affirmation of your experience here, but part of what makes it a good experience too, just like what makes therapy good, is you as a student came here open to, when you said, I had this particular posture and that changed, you were open. See, that to me is an example of that. I'm open to accepting influence. We are, at the centerpiece, again, a colleague who's very central to our field here talks about just the critical nature of the transformative experience. And we've had people come through and say, I'm not going to go be a clinician, but this hasn't been a wasted 2 years because it's been transformative to me. Now, I would hope for the time and money and effort you would spend here, you would move in that particular direction. But, above all, we hope that, it's transformative in some way.
Well, I will affirm that if a person decides to go, I mean, you can go, you want to do the LPC route. I've got social workers. At the end of the day, when you go through it, I found that going through the MFT program for me, a little bit of a pitch, is that systemic lens has served me so well as I study trauma individually and collectively. I think the systemic lens has set me up so well. I think the other thing is it set me up to be a great dialogue partner with other disciplines. So a psychologist, Dr. Pardo right there, a social worker right next door to me, LPC right there. Like I'm my practice, I have 12 women I work with. I'm the only male. And so if you work systems, the reason why they brought me on, because I have a master's in marriage and family therapy, and they really people appreciate systemic thinkers, and we can dial in and do the individual piece too. Right. So it's not a either or, it's just, and then you get prepared really well. Anyway, I love the program. I couldn't recommend it high enough.
Oh, thank you, Kyle.
Any upcoming announcements that you want to share? I mean, you guys are, you guys have come through the pandemic. Obviously, it's just what, you guys just started a new cohort. It's the fall, right? You guys just started a new cohort.
Yeah, our particular program starts every fall in August. And if you are interested in our program, we would love to have you reach out to us. Probably the best thing, you can find more information about the university and our program at friends.edu. So it's a very simple way, and you can find your link through the academic place to graduate programs and then marriage and family therapy. There are 2 different locations. As you know, Kyle, you graduated from our program that's operating in the Kansas City area. The main campus of Friends University is in Wichita. So we have 2 different sites for that. We're really excited about, there's some really interesting technology that's been developed called mixed reality simulation. And just like airplane pilots who get on a simulator where they can really practice things and deal with things that might be difficult so that if they make a mistake, lives are not lost.
Hmm.
Our clinical training is really important to us here, but we also have moved into adopting some interesting technology where people can now engage a live animated avatar. And that I'm not talking about just a talking head. There's incredible technology. You've sort of seen people on green screens with those
Yeah.
wires attached everywhere that or even I've not watched the show, but that show where now there's people who are avatars that are they're singing.
I saw that. Yeah.
I don't know what it's called, but so this is they look you lives you can have one or two people and it's animated by a trained actor in this particular field to act out so we can practice what we're learning. And it's kind of an innovative thing in the field. It's somewhat new. Other disciplines might be doing this a bit more, but MFT is really beginning to explore this. And we have, because of a grant we had a chance to really be early on in adapting this. And so there's some fun technological things that we're trying to do here. Coming out of the pandemic, we're moving into a world where telehealth is going to be here to stay.
Oh, yeah.
So I love that you and I can have this exchange in very different locations. And there's some really positive things. There's a lot of legal and ethical and technical things to think about for doing therapeutic services in a telehealth area. And so we are working to develop that piece as well. We would love if we can make some things happen to develop maybe a virtual clinic that would allow us to expand our services to throughout the whole state rather than just our local area. So those are some of the innovative things that we're doing. And we continue to have a number of our faculty that are involved at the leadership levels of our particular field, which I'm really, really quite proud of. And but if you're interested, we would love to. We have information nights once a month to tell you more about our program. We have 4 interviews during the course of the year. We've already had our first one. And we would love to tell you more about the program if it sounds like it would be something that would be helpful and useful to you.
Well, I just want to thank you so much for joining today, taking your time on your sabbatical, which I hold this and I cherish that, that you gave us this time during this. And I want to tell you what I tell all my guests, that we are with you and God is for you. Thank you so much for joining.
Thank you, Kyle.
Well, if you stayed with us throughout the entire video, I want to thank you so much for hanging in there. I am very excited about this interview and also the future topics that we have coming up. I think the other thing is that, when we think about the holidays coming up and so forth, I just want us to be thinking and reaching out before it gets here in the thick of it. I just want my viewers, not just my clients, but my viewers to be thinking about how to love themselves through these challenging, but also good times. I'll see you next time.